A few words about Sophie before we start. Let her start. Let me do this. Sophie Perinot has enjoyed a decade-long career writing historical fiction. She has authored solo novels, The Sister Queens and Medici's Daughter, centering on strong royal women facing challenges so essentially human that they transcend any era. Additionally, she's worked with fellow writers like Kate Quinn, Ben Kane, Eliza Knight, and Heather Webb to create collaborative historical novels about the women of the French Revolution, Ribbons of Scarlet, and the destruction of Pompeii, A Day of Fire. Most recently, Sophie took on a new genre and incarnation, authoring crime fiction as Evie Hawtrey. Even her mystery has history in it. And by Fire, published this year, features a mystery rooted in the 1666 Great Fire of London, as well as a modern London set storyline. Sophie, or Evie, she genuinely answers to anything, splits her time between Washington, D.C., where she lives with her husband, and York, UK, where she enjoys living in history, lingering over teas, and knocking around in pubs. I'm going to put both of Sophie's web addresses in the chat. And now, without further ado, Sophie Perinot.
Thank you. I will say, everyone, I actually am just back from York. I was back a week yesterday. I spent a month in York and definitely knocked around in a lot of pubs. But today, today I'm going to talk about a struggle, and the struggle is real, my fellow authors. How do we use detail to build historical worlds for our readers without straying into over-description in a way that takes readers out of our stories? And obviously today I'm going to give one author's take, mine. And you don't have to accept mine, and it's like every other part of writing, what works for me won't work for everyone. But I had to give a fair amount of thought to this because I think it was last year, I was included in an article in Writers Magazine on showing, not telling, and how much detail was enough. And it made me really examine a lot of this. I think any discussion of descriptive detail in writing always seems to circle back to the popular mantra that we never get behind, which is show, don't tell, show, don't tell. I personally tend to look at that admonition as one prong of a two-pronged fork. So there's how you offer detail to readers, which you should lean towards showing, not telling. That's prong one. And then there's the volume of that detail. And I like to think of that as a very pointy prong two. Obviously, as authors, we absolutely need to take our readers into the world of our novels, worlds that in the case of historical fiction are pretty much entirely outside of their personal experience. Because let's face it, whether you're writing ancient Rome, whether you're writing World War II, whether you're writing medieval France, the world of your novel is not, it's just simply not one that readers are going to instinctively recognize. So that means as historical novelists, we have to employ a level of description that aren't needed in many other genres. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but sometimes don't you think, damn, if I wrote a novel set in 2021 during the pandemic, I would not have to explain what a KN95 mask is or what it looks like. I would just say her KN95 mask slipped momentarily below her nose, and everybody reading the book would kind of nod. Yeah, happened to me, totally know what that is. But instead, I find myself quite often trying to describe a Spanish farthingale and why it might make it difficult for several women to pass through a doorway at once. I mean, we're just in a different situation than most people. I mean, I guess fantasy authors can identify with this because they're just, you know, they're winging it. But building a three-dimensional, fully realized historical settings is something that absolutely requires a skilled use of detail. So let's get to the nitty gritty. And I'm going to start with prong one, because that seems logical. How do we offer descriptive details? So what do? Every time I need to describe something, from the inside of a royal carriage to a new character who walks onto the scene for the first time, I start by asking myself, who gets to offer up this description? Because really the first question is, through whose eyes is my reader going to see these details, or through whose nose, in the case of Restoration London and the streets, through whose nose are they going to smell them? Choice one is pretty obviously the narrator, that talking head that's in every novel. And it doesn't matter whether you're writing third person past, first person present, you're going to have a narrator's voice in there. And honestly, I think we get so caught up in show, don't tell. First of all, you can show with a narrator. You just have to be careful to do it. But also, I think we get so caught up in there, we forget that there's nothing really wrong with using the talking head to world build, especially when you're getting the basics out there. The basics like the layout of a salon in Versailles, or the atmosphere in the street of Restoration London, or the skyline of Rome as it's viewed from the Palazzo Barberini in the 16th or 17th century. Those are all settings I've written, and I tend to have quite often, which makes me unpopular, I guess, in many quarters, I tend to sometimes have first-person present tense narrators, but not narrators, point of view characters, but there's still a narrator, and I'm not afraid to use my talking head voice. Additionally, I think the narrator's voice is a great tool when you need to illustrate something that it's unlikely your point of view character is going to notice, because they see it every day. They handle it every minute. For example, if you walk into your own bedroom after this is over, you don't generally observe the color of the carpet or the quantity of the light. You're more likely in a setting that you go into every day to notice something that's out of the ordinary or that's out of place. So if I walk into my bedroom and a lamp has fallen over, that's what I'm going to notice. And the same thing is true for a 16th century queen going into a royal chapel to pray. She goes into that chapel every day to pray. So if I try to channel through her a minute detailed description of it, that's going to seem a little false, because she's not going to notice all those things. So just bear with me here, because I'm going to wing this here. So imagine I'm writing a scene right now. It's set in my office with the crime tape on the chair here. And this room is going to figure heavily in my story later, because eventually I'm going to find a body here. If the point of the character is me, I'm probably better off having the narrator tackle the first time I bring you into this room, because of what needs to be noticed. So here we go, gonna spitball it. Now, I'm looking now, it's afternoon. I might say something like, the afternoon light slanted through the enormous sliding glass doors along the south wall at an angle suggesting the sun was past its apex, casting shadows of tree branches on the light wood floor. A desk, groaning with papers and thoroughly disorganized, sat in the middle of a worn and much-loved oriental carpet. But Sophie's eyes were fixed on the computer set at the desk's middle as she made for the chair, desperate to jot down the idea that had come to her as she refilled her mug in the kitchen, which is how she ended up tripping over the Boston Terrier and sending the steaming hot coffee flying. So if the point of view character is not me, but someone entering my office, that gives me a second alternative. But if I am the point of view character and I really want you to see all those things, I'm better off letting the narrator do that. I'm too busy cleaning up the coffee I just spilled anyway. Our second alternative, which is I just kind of alluded to, is to use characters to convey description. And this is personally my go-to. I use point of view characters whenever possible to put detail into my novels, especially important details. So why? Well, first off, having characters notice things is more interesting as a way of showing them to the reader than if I recite them the same details, which can get a bit tell. And also, when you have a character see something for me or taste something for me, not only does the thing comes fully to life in a way that it just doesn't if the narrator is doing it. Like if I had just told that coffee story, but the coffee had gone all over me and I'd gotten burned, it might have been more exciting. That wasn't important enough for me to do it that way. But let's, for example, take an example from a book that I am working on. So let's say your main character is a musician in 17th century Rome, and he has snuck backstage at a rehearsal, and a vocalist he has never heard begins to sing. Now, the narrator can tell me at that moment, it was the most beautiful soprano voice that Niccolo had ever heard. Boom, boom, you told me, or you can show me. So I'm going to read you the description that shows this. And this I did write down for myself. I'm not winging this one. The central figure turned downstage and raised her hands to the heavens. Her caftan's gold-laced trim sleeves fell back to reveal tapered forearms and fingers of extraordinary length and delicacy. The orchestra began. Lips the color of the rose Leonora had plucked parted, and out came a voice such as I had never heard. High, clear, and utterly, utterly captivating. Its tone was as pure as that of a small boy singing in church, yet the notes were supported by a great deal more power, and each one shimmered as vocal silver. On and on he went, every note perfect, and I found myself praying that the aria would not end, because I knew when it did, the silence that followed would be painful, or worse still, the next voice to sing would be as a braying mule by comparison. When the piece did end, I did not realize I was applauding wildly until Pasqualini's eyes found me. Those dark eyes nearly sucked me out of the shadows onto the stage. Then Rossi's voice cried out, "Who is that? Show yourself." And I ran. So I hope what I've conveyed with that is the details that come through a character tend to become more three-dimensional. They tend to be less likely to slip into telling mode. But additionally, when description is channeled through a character, we get a bonus. We learn something about that person. First of all, the simple fact that somebody notices something in and of itself illustrates their interests, their background, and their likes and dislikes. Because let's face it, especially in historical fiction, something is as prevalent as your social class might influence what you notice in a particular scene and how you notice it. So what people notice and how they notice it shows us about the person. But beyond that, characters editorialize in descriptions. I mean, we editorialize in real life. I'm sure I'm not the only one who actually editorializes in my own head when I see things. And it's really better, because if I said a lot of this out loud, it wouldn't be ideal. So you can show me who your character is while showing me the same thing. So now let's pretend I'm writing a scene and I want to show you a snake. The snake's going to be important further in the scene. Character one sees the snake and thinks, ooh, and scrambles onto a chair to avoid the hideous, writhing serpent. Character number two, instead, sees the same snake and thinks, so beautiful. And they notice the creature's exquisite, thin, black pupils, vertical pupils, knowing that those slits set against the yellow-green eyeballs likely mark the serpent as poisonous. But still, character two stands back, quiet and still, watching the graceful creature slide along the garden wall and disappear into a hole there. In both descriptions, the reader gets to see the snake. But in the first description, you, the writer, are showing me that your character fears snakes, as well as showing me the snake. And if you choose to show me the snake through the eyes of that second character, if that's your character, you're showing me your character knows enough about snakes to decode those eyeballs, to know that snake is poisonous, but your character doesn't fear that snake. And that is pretty much a bonus. That's something I get beyond seeing the snake. Okay, so obviously, if you haven't noticed from my level of enthusiasm there, I love seeing historical worlds through the characters in them. But there's a caveat, because all of life is one giant caveat. And as authors, we have to be absolutely certain the detail you choose to have your character observe is something your character would actually notice in real life. And everybody just needs to think about that for a minute, because we are writing historical fiction, and describing everyday objects can become particularly problematic in our genre, because we have readers who are not familiar with the daily life objects of past centuries, but our point of view characters are pretty much entirely comfortable with them. That makes it really tricky. Because if I'm familiar with something, I'm very unlikely to notice it in an extravagant level of detail. So imagine if in a modern novel, I wrote, she put her coffee cup in the sink, admiring the two stainless steel basins recessed into the counter with a single central handle. You would immediately say to me, nobody notices their own kitchen sink in that level of detail, because they don't. So the bottom line is, we need to avoid, whether it's the narrator or the characters, merely serving an expository function when it comes to our world building. We need to avoid them noticing or describing things purely for the purpose of reader education, but catch 22, we have to educate the reader, which kind of segues nicely and on purpose into prong number 2 of my descriptive pointy fork, which is the volume of detail and how to strike the right balance in world building and how you know when you've gone too far. And here is where, if I haven't already, I expect to ruffle some feathers, because I personally think a fair amount of historical fiction over describes in a way that takes readers out of the story. And I think there's a nearly epidemic amount of teaching the reader and also of authors showing off what they've learned in some historical novels. That loses the reader rather than enthralling them. And I don't know about you, but if my business is selling books, I do not want to lose the reader. I need the reader to hang in there with me. So I would argue that even when we're building a very foreign world, we need to be focused on a few striking, evocative details rather than paragraphs full of minutia. So once I was working on a novel, and I sent one of my kids who was studying abroad in Rome back to a particular historical palace because I found I was setting something in a room and I hadn't taken enough notes. And what I said to that child was, find me a detail that sticks out and send it to me. Find me a carving on a mantle. Find me an unusual sized or colored door. I mean, like, wouldn't you love to be my kid? It's like, hey, it's your afternoon off in the city. Go and find me a door. But I didn't want to describe that room from floor to ceiling. I wanted a couple of things. I wanted a fresco, and I wanted a striking bit of architecture to catch the eye of my character and bring my reader into that room. Or in my latest novel, which is when I turn to crime, I have a corpse turn up outside of the Church of St. Magnus the Martyr in London. And obviously the corpse is the focal point of that scene, because I'm sorry, if you find a dead body that's been lit on fire outside a church, you're probably not looking at the church architecture. So rather than describe the whole exterior of St. Magnus the Martyr, I wanted, and I only used one evocative detail, which is I placed the corpse under, there's a large black exterior clock on the outside of St. Magnus the Martyr with a golden cherub's face on it that's suspended. And I put that immediately above the body. And that took us to the place without it seeming like my protagonist was noticing minute Christopher Wren designed architectural details when there's a smoldering body that you could just smell to the point of puking right there on the pavement. As a reader, I recently had an experience that I'm going to share, although the book is clearly going to remain nameless. So I start the opening of the book. The main character is attending a dinner party in London. In the first 10 pages of this book, I am not exaggerating to say that I met between 12 and 15 people, either directly as they interacted with the point of view character, or because the character noticed them across the room or noticed them talking to someone else. So that was quite a lot to begin with already, but I swear I'm not making this up. I got a detailed physical description of every one of those people. It was almost like a checklist form. Weight, check. Hair color, check. Height, check. And if it was a woman, dress color, and at least one detail of that dress. So now I had no way of discerning which of these characters was significant and which were the bit players. I mean, I would have if the author had settled for saying something like, The room was crowded with individuals swirling and shifting in the pre-dinner dance of introductions and light conversation. And then she'd gone on to point out a few people who were either, and I discovered this later in the book, they were either of interest at that moment because the moment was about to get big and important. And I could have just seen those people. Or it turns out there were a couple fairly main characters, including a love interest in that scene, who I was going to find out were important later. I was going to see throughout multiple pages of the book, but I had no idea who they were then because they didn't show me just the people of interest at the moment or characters who were going to continue to be part of the larger story arc. And because everyone was described equally and nobody was memorable, it just wasn't telegraphed to me who I was supposed to be focusing on. So I plowed on, but the overdescription continued. It was true for every room. It was true for every dress. It was true for every desktop. It was true for every person. And basically, this ended up being a book that I set down at around the 50-page mark because I was just too bogged down. I couldn't care about the central conflict. And there were moments, there were scenes in which I couldn't remember what the heck I literally couldn't remember what the heck the central conflict was. And I think we can all agree that if a reader gets bogged down in description, the description is not our friend. So how do we avoid the bog? So how do we make fiction vivid, dramatically alive without overdoing it? I have a couple of mantras that I personally use, a couple of things that I used to have written on my desk, but I've now been doing this long enough that probably, like, in an emergency situation, if you held a gun to my head, I wouldn't need help remembering them. The first one is, writers have to know multiple times more about their time period, about their settings, and about their characters than readers need to know. And I know that hurts. You think, wow, gosh, I spent 7 hours today on, the difference between a French and a Spanish farthingale, and what year did it come to which court, and why did but none of what we do is actually wasted. None of what we know is actually wasted. The things that we know as historical novelists, but we never explicitly tell or show, still contribute to the immersive experience that we weave for our readers. So it's not a waste, and we believe you did the research even if you don't show it all to us. Whereas if you dump everything you know on your reader, we're going to be unable to sort it out, and we're going to lie there. I don't know if all of you are friends, or if any of you are fans of the movie Christmas Story with Ralphie and the leg lamp and everything, but there's that moment when Randy lay there like a slug. It was his only defense. And that's how I feel sometimes when the detail's overwhelming. I feel like I'm laying like a dead thing, just trapped under these heavy paragraphs, and I have no will to get up. And that's when I put aside the book. So I don't think we want to do that. So that's mantra number one. I need to know way more than I show or tell. Mantra number two is every word. And I don't just mean descriptive words. Every word in a book needs to have a purpose. Yes, that purpose can include bringing readers into a scene. That's what a set in a play does. You come to the theater, the curtain's probably already up, you're sitting there waiting for it to start, and the scenery is there. But you need to show me what's necessary and meaningful. I mean, to go back to the theater metaphor, set designers curate their sets. And authors need to curate their literary settings in a similar way. So the more detail you give me about a thing or a person or a place, the more I personally, and again, this is just me, the more I personally as a reader expect that person, that place, or that thing to either prove to be significant at a later point in the story. Because God help you, if you describe a clock to me for 2 pages and someone isn't hit over the head with that clock later, or that clock isn't significant, I'm not going to be amused. The other thing it can do is it has to establish or reveal something insightful or significant about a character. I mean, you can tell me about that clock if that clock was given to your character by their now dead mother, and as the palace is burning, it's the only thing they want to save, and then by all means, go long on the clock. But the more you tell me about some place, something, or some person, the more they either have to themselves be essential to your story, or they have to illustrate something significant about an event or a character that is story essential. That's my rule. When it comes to descriptive details, I really think quality rules over quantity. It's what's relevant and what's purposeful in terms of the story. So pick something pithy, pick something memorable. If you do that, you will suck me into the scene. I will be there. It will be vividly alive, and I will understand what it is to live in that era. So how do we look for, because we're all going to do it, I do it. How are we going to look for the tells that we've gone overboard? And we've got a scene in which we've kind of embarrassed ourselves by spending 6 paragraphs on a clock. I think the best time is reading through your first draft. It's a great time to look for tells. Have you done too much? What are some of those tells? First one's pretty easy. Is there so much description in any scene or any passage that your mind is wandering, that you think to yourself, this is a really good time to take a break from editing and go refill that coffee that I'm going to spill later on my desk in my scenario that I described earlier? Those are not good signs. If your mind is wandering, if you think this is the perfect time to take a break and make my grocery list, look at those paragraphs. The other thing is, when a descriptive paragraph or a section ends and the action resumes, do you find yourself thinking, wait, where am I? Like, where am I? What just happened before this description? If you have to go back before the description and scan the last non-descriptive paragraph, you've run on too long with the description. You've broken the chain of action, you've set the person adrift. As a reader, and that's how I look at this really. When I'm doing this, I look at it as a reader. As a reader, I don't like to feel disoriented. If I've been set adrift in your book simply because you got carried away with describing a dress or a room or a sunset to the point where I don't remember what your characters were doing, that's not a book that's going to hold my attention long-term. And then, do you have a sneaking suspicion? This is definitely one that happens to me. Do you have a sneaking suspicion that you've described something, a ritual, a horrible restoration beauty product, a method for harvesting grapes, because when you were reading about it during research, you were fascinated by it? And are you putting it in the book for that reason rather than because it's actually relevant to your story arc? What I do with that stuff is pull it out of my draft and turn it into a blog post for later on, because you're going to need a whole bunch of blog posts when you launch this book. And that's actually in my last book, what I did with a horrible beauty product. The Restoration era had a beauty product called puppy water. And I actually didn't include it in my book because I felt people would be so turned off, they would wish all my characters died in that era, in which people literally boiled puppies that they killed in oil with various ingredients, and then ladies put that on their faces. And I was, needless to say, enthralled and fascinated by this and also nauseated when I researched it, but it didn't belong in my book. So I wrote a blog post on it. It actually turned out to be almost one of the most, I think, the most popular blog post on my blog surrounding my book. So you can take these things out and use them for something else. But if you're only putting it in there because it's fascinating and you love it, that's really not reason enough. In addition to gauging kind of ruthlessly whether you've gone overboard during the first reading, and I do think you need to be ruthless because we never want to kill our darlings, and that goes for descriptions too. Remember, when you're reading that first draft, and circling back to something I said earlier, to keep an eye out for descriptions that ring false, that are going to take your reader out of the book. So yes, you can teach the reader, but in a manner that's organic to their overall experience of the book. So the example I'm going to use, since all I like to talk about, it should be clear from this, is farthingales. It's a farthingale experience. It's farthingale example. So you can explain the difference between a Spanish and a French farthingale, but you have to do it carefully. So your character can't say, I thought about the words of his letter as my woman secured my Spanish farthingale at my waist, a conically shaped undergarment that would support the under and overskirts of my gown. I'm sorry, that's super teachy, and there's no way your character is thinking that. She puts that damn farthingale on every day, whether she likes to or not. What she can say is, as my woman secured my Spanish farthingale at my waist, I looked at myself in the glass dissatisfied. how was I ever to attract a husband in my increasingly out-of-fashion wardrobe? Ever since the French farthingale had arrived at court half a year ago, all the most fashionable ladies surrounding the queen boasted silhouettes accentuating their hips. Yet here I was, still shaped like an upside-down cone, like a woman of my mother's generation. So now you've shown me the farthingale in a way that's believable because she's fretting over the fact that her clothes are outdated, rather than just saying, let me explain to you, Spanish farthingale is a waist-nipping cone, French farthingale is a wheel that Elizabeth I became fond of. So I think that's part of it. You can do it, you've got to do it carefully. So far, obviously, we've been talking about the descriptive building of historical settings, and that's key. I mean, you can't have historical characters wandering around in a vacuum. But as I hinted at in my snake example, descriptions make characters come alive too. So before I move on to questions or everybody flees, before I give any more farthingale examples, I want to make a pitch for applying the same rubric that I've just discussed to character descriptions that we're applying to settings and objects. So in other words, be selective. In my second unpopular opinion of the afternoon, I'm going to say, in my opinion, when it comes to characters, physical description alone doesn't cut it. Many authors seem to believe that describing the physicality of characters is the most important factor to making them come to life. At the risk of being driven out of this chapter meeting and never allowed back, I'm going to argue it's the least important. I mean, think about it for a moment. What I'm wearing today, unless it is some sort of striking statement-making choice, and it's not, right? It's a burgundy V-neck sweater. That, and the fact my hair needs touching up because I went to York for a month and now you can see all my gray roots. Neither of those things tell you who I am. Well, the hair might tell you I'm a little bit lazy, but they don't tell you who I am. And I hope to God, seriously, that that's not what you're going to remember when we all log off today, that that's the most interesting thing about me. So you're going to remember when we're done that I have gray in my hair and I wore a burgundy sweater. So personally, I'd rather read descriptions of characters' actions and behaviors. And I mean the types of actions and behaviors that capture what they're like on the inside. I want characters' souls. I want to know what their hopes are, what their dreams are. I want to see that through their actions. That's going to make them alive for me. I really do not care about their hair color. I really don't. You can tell me, because I guess some readers do care about it, but ultimately, that's not what I'm focused on. So show me their souls. And for example, the last collaborative novel that I participated in was Ribbons of Scarlet, which was a novel of women of the French Revolution. And I needed to make, we each had our own protagonist for that. I needed to make my protagonist, Princess Elizabeth, who's the sister of the doom-kinged Louis, come alive for readers. And this was a super delicate task because this is a book filled with revolutionary-minded women, and I am writing the only protagonist who is an openly avowed defender of the monarchy. This made book tour really fun. I mean, really fun. And it would have been really easy to let her become a kind of a cardboard representation of the villainous monarchy, which is how every other character in the book viewed it. But that isn't who she was, and I needed to show who she was. Showing Elizabeth's physicality, showing her plump figure, showing her height, showing her hair color, showing the embroidery on her gowns, even showing her shoes. She collected shoes. She was mad for shoes. None of that was going to make her a living, breathing person inside readers' heads. And yet, just to beat you over the head with this point, time and time again, the first thing authors rush to describe is how somebody looks. So Elizabeth is this complicated woman. She's known specifically for her charity and piety. She wanted to be a nun, but her brother asked her not to become one, so she didn't. So she's not a stereotypical royal-centered, overindulgent person. I can tell readers that. I could tell you she was pious and she gave all of the produce from her farm to charity, but why the hell should you believe me? I'm just a talking head in this book. That's all authors really are. We're talking heads. So I needed to show you that. So I ended up showing it in many ways, but for example, when Princess Elizabeth was about to witness the first ever execution by guillotine, this is long before it was used in the Terror, and actually it was developed as a more humane way to execute people. She filtered this experience through her personality as well as her eyes. And in my opinion, and you know, if you ever read the book and you read the scene, you feel free to differ with me on this, but in my opinion, no amount of vivid attestation on my part, no amount of vivid description of her empathetic and compassionate nature could have brought those characteristics alive for my readers as much as experiencing that grisly scene through her smell and her sight and her psyche did for people. And so I would say, use your characters and show me your characters, but show me what makes them compelling, not just their physicality. So I've talked way too much and way too fast. And if this was a novel in the first draft, we would be cutting this like crazy. But at this point, I'm wondering if anyone has anything they'd like to say about the detail of world building, you know, anything they want to take issue with about the balance, or anything else that I've talked about, because I think discussion is always very welcome, especially at this point of the afternoon. Oh God, no.
I'd like to say how much I appreciate what you've done, because by making sure that all details are salient, that makes it easy for me to go through a draft and check them. Because then I can go through every detail and say, is this either striking to the character or necessary for the reader? And I can just check them off and say, you know, that's too much. I don't need it. Don't ever come back to it. It's really helpful to just keep that salience as an idea. I really appreciate this.
Well, and definitely think too, if it shows us something about your character, because that's the most, I think, I mean, in real life, we learn more about people every day from their reactions to things, from what they choose to tell us and don't choose to tell us, than if they sat down and hand us their resume. So I'm glad that's helpful, because it's definitely helped me. Probably later, somebody will say, I read your books and there's too much description in it, and that'll be fair, but at least I'm trying.
Yeah, I wrote that down too. One evocative detail. That's part of my takeaway from your comments. And I think that's really helpful, because that's when I think about things I've read, you know, certain, you know, one evocative detail is, you know, sticking in the mind, is going to be a peg that I can hang a lot of other information on. And that was great. And I agree with you that the writer needs to know more than the reader, but doesn't need to flaunt that. It'll just show. It'll just show in depth and in texture. But it's always, we always have to fight against those information dumps. They're so obvious.
Right, and I think people don't want to feel like we're teaching. I think the beauty of historical fiction is people learn a lot of history, and I always call it a gateway drug. I actually spoke 2 weeks ago. I do a university lecture every second year about the role of historical fiction in popular history and a lot of different things like that. And what's interesting about it is, I think historical fiction is a better gateway drug into history than most other popular consumer, certainly than film, certainly than television. And the most exciting thing is, and I just had this happen to me this week, a book Instagrammer said they just had finished my new book, and they said, I got fascinated by the Great Fire of London, and I took out a bunch of books and I Googled it. And that's the thing. If we don't teach people, if we don't hit people over the head with it, but we make it interesting, people are going to go out and look for additional information, and that ball starts rolling, and people are going to realize that history is fascinating. And yes, it's a remote place, but the thing I love most, I'm sure everybody here does, about historical fiction is the essential humanity of people doesn't actually change. So when we were writing Ribbons of Scarlet and we were seeing these women who'd been written out of the history of the French Revolution, who fought with pikes and written philosophy, and most of them ended up dying and also being defamed in a lot of ways that women traditionally are defamed, you know, implying loose moral character and different behaviors. And I thought, how much is that a story that a lot of women who are trying to make change today can still identify with? But I think if we make it too teachy and we make it like history class was in middle school, we don't achieve what we really want to do.
We want to whet their appetite.
Yes, and then now I feel guilty because I did have a really good night. No one here knows my middle school history teacher, because I did have one good one and one bad one. So I had one that explained the 3/5 compromise wrong. And I'm like so old and I'm still not over that. So.
Sophie, I want to say that you just gave me a gem when you release the information about world building actually through the characters' POV. Am I right by saying that?
Yes.
By showing the world building. I love that. I love it. That takes away all these archaic things I got from teachers who said, well, what were they wearing? What was in the room? And what was this? And all of a sudden you brought it to life for me to show the reader something more essential than just details.
Right. And I mean, obviously, sometimes you have to show, like I have in my 1666 timeline in my current book, my main character is riding through the streets before the Great Fire of London, and I need to show how filthy they are, and I need to show that the buildings nearly touch over her head, and because that's all about to be destroyed, and 80% of London's going to burn, and it's never going to look like that again, and the smell of the river. And I do need to show that, but I need to show it in a way that she would actually, so I have her get stuck in traffic and people are moving alongside the character and a rat runs by and scares somebody next to the carriage who jumps, as opposed to just describing. But I do think Tell gets a bad rap to a certain extent, because it's perfectly fine to start a chapter as a narrator and say, the golden rays of the sun were reflecting off the dome of St. Paul's as the sun set behind the Tiber. You don't have to have a character walk into the room and see that out the window, because that is just basic scene setting. But I think you're right. When it comes to what's important, the more important it is, the more likely I am to wish I could see it through the eyes of a character.
Thank you. It's excellent.
Lee?
Yeah, I had actually written some comments, but I think it was refreshing for me to hear you talk about author intrusion, because I've read so many books lately where they do that. They just have a big information dump after a piece of dialogue or something, and then the author intrudes and explains what was going on or something like that. And it just throws you right out of the story. And boy, that was pounded into my head when I was taking my writing classes. And the teacher would always say, your research is showing, and just get rid of it, and that kind of thing. You have to weave it in. But I wondered, one of my pet peeve books is Where the Crawdads Sing. Huge hit. First person narrative from the main character, but she describes her own hair. She takes her piece of brown hair and things like that, I wondered how you felt about it, and her huge description of the bayou and all the plants and everything before you even get into the story, which had again pounded into me that's something that is passé and don't do it anymore.
Well, it's interesting.
Don't do it.
I've never read that book, but when I was in high school, I read Return of the Native. So Hardy's Return of the Native. And the first 3 pages of that book are just our description of the Moor. And I know it was written in a different era, but I read a lot of classics. And I remember thinking to myself, dear God, at this point, I have no idea what the story's about, and I don't care. And I have to read this because Sister Mary Assumpta expects me to finish it and write an essay on it, but I have no interest in reading it whatsoever. And And, you know, so I think that can happen. And also, I mean, I obviously noticed, I pointed out 15 times that while I was in New York for a month, my hair got gray around the edges. Which just, but what does that show you? Not that my hair is gray, it shows you that I'm kind of vain. So it bothers me that my hair is gray, and now I'm on camera and everyone knows my hair is gray, and you know, I've pointed out 17 times, but I don't think I would notice. I might notice if my hair looked really terrific, but you're right, for someone to notice their own hair color. The other thing I want to ask people, because this is me, maybe I'm in the minority. I don't see characters the way authors describe them anyway, most of the time. And I don't see characters, which is why I never do. All these authors always say, well, what would be your dream cast for your characters if it was going to be a movie? First of all, I'm not famous enough, and it's never going to be a movie. But second of all, I don't want my characters to be seen by others the way I see them. I want every person to read my book to make my character be the person they are interested in, I want them to make them alive. So that after I finish drafting my book and I go through this grief period, which I actually do, my kids will tell you they avoid me right after I finish. Because when my characters stop talking to me and I'm just going to edit them, it is like somebody died. It's like somebody died for me. I want those characters to live on, and I want people to see them in a way that reflects them. So they don't need to see the character as a redhead just because they were historically a redhead or I think they're a redhead. So is that just me, or is it very important to everyone that they have a physical description and they think of the character the way the author described them? Or do you guys feel free to see them however you need to see them?
I have a main character in my book that I didn't even know really what she looked like till almost the end. I just knew what I wanted her to be and the type of person she was and what her values were. But then later in the end, I did create a blog post with an image of her. But yeah, I mean, I started from that perspective of just wanting to get across who she was.
Well, and if somebody saw them a different way, because I can't see the comments, unfortunately, I'm just seeing now, someone said, two of my characters modeled for Botticelli, so people know what they look like from the paintings, and that is definitely true. But if the person wasn't familiar with the Botticelli paintings, or if the person didn't have them on their desk while they were reading the book, and they started imagining those characters like their grandmother, who they have a picture of when she was young, or like their best friend, would that bother you? See, that wouldn't bother me at all. They can imagine them any way they like. They need to imagine them in the way that makes them fully human for them. But I think that's a fairly controversial viewpoint, especially for historical characters. Oh, I like the Robin. Someone said novelist Robin Maxwell says research should be like a lady's slip. It should be there, but not show. And I think that is perfect. That is perfect.
I was just going to pick up on where the crawdads sing and support that point about why would Kaya, I guess her name is Kaya, why would she point it out when there actually are the love interest characters who would be the ones to say that, you know, they would, so give it to them. You don't need to give it to her, you know. And the other thing I wanted to say is, if you are a reader of New Yorker fiction or of New York Times, you know, critiques and stuff, you might have seen where historical fiction kind of gets a bad rap because, and I've seen this several different critiques and reviews, you know, too much attention to clothing. And, you know, some of the literary writers just think that's ridiculous. You know, there's way too much attention to clothing, and they don't care for the genre thing anyhow. But, you know, there's something to that, you know, that you could be a little more, you know, on the literary side and make it a more powerful book, you know, and stuff. You know, so.
Well, and I think everybody's going to have a different, but I know also that's changed, I think, from before I even was published. I went to every single Historical Novel Society of North America conference starting in 2005. And in 2005, I really had no business being there at all. I didn't have a finished manuscript, but I wanted to go to the sessions on the business end of things, because I felt like I didn't know anything about the business end of things. And if I was going to do this, I needed to know about the business end of things. And I think there used to be, you know, that was the era of when biographical fiction was huge and everything was tutor because people thought I was crazy. They were like, "You're going to write France? You can't write France." And now you can't. And Ancient World was big, and I love Ancient World, and now everything is 20th century. So it ebbs and flows, but there was a lot of costume description, and I think there is an audience for that. I think this genre, like every genre, not everybody likes every science fiction book. I obviously don't like every classic. I've just obviously made clear I don't like Return of the Native. And I actually stopped reading. I never stopped reading a book until I was in my 40s. I finished every book I started.
Mhm.
And then I read Confederacy of Dunces, which is obviously a prize-winning book. And I got to the end of that and I thought, oh my God, if I die this week, I was so aggravated by the protagonist in that book. And I thought, if I die this week, I wasted all that time. And I'm nearer to death than I am to birth now, and I'm never finishing another book I don't enjoy.
Yeah.
So I think that the bottom line is if someone gets my books and says, I feel disappointed, we were at a ball and I didn't see every gown, that's okay. Then my book's not for them. And there is a book out there that's going to show them every gown. I've read them. I just don't like them.
Diana, you're muted.
Sorry. Sean had a comment before I did. Did you make your comment, Sean?
Oh, description with character action and internal dialogue. I love the internal dialogue idea.
Yeah, I put it in the notes.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I just see that now. You think after all these years of Zoom since the start of the pandemic, I would have mastered it, but you'd be wrong. Because I always forget about the comments. I do think internal, I love seeing what people think. I don't know about anybody else, but I love seeing what people think. And let's face it, we're pretty candid with what we think because nobody else hears it but us. So that's a great place to have the person observing things, perhaps in a non-charitable way that they wouldn't say out loud, and let the audience see that. As my mom would say, and my kids would know this, there are certain things we don't say till we're in the car because it's a small world. And you think the person in the next bathroom stall has no idea what you're talking about, and they actually end up being the cousin of the person you're speaking about. So the internal dialogue is almost like in the car. You can say anything there.
Yeah, and I try to keep keep it like to the description to like a phrase in a sentence of what that person's doing. For example, the scene I just wrote last week was one officer has just gotten a set of orders that he doesn't like. And rather than argue about it, he breaks eye contact and looks at the birds skimming over the swamp across the railroad out through the window beyond the senior commander's desk. So.
And that obviously tells us a lot more than if you had the narrator say, he was uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I mean, you're showing us that he's uncomfortable. So that's better.
On the topic of clothing, and this is just a very short, true story. I was in a restaurant with my sister, and Chris Christopherson walked in with his agent and Carly Simon. And I had gone to college with Chris. And we had a class together that he took his senior year and I was a sophomore. He had to have that class to graduate. He must have struggled. And at the end, the professor said, tomorrow, the first and second, high scoring papers are going to give a presentation. And so, and then we got notes who it was. And I didn't know who the other person was. And it was Chris. Well, okay, and I beat him. But anyway, 10 years later, I'm in this restaurant with my sister, and I send drinks over there and write a note on the napkin saying, Pomona 61 says hello to Pomona 59. I was a friend of your sister Karen's. And I get a note back and more and drinks coming to my table, and he says, join us on the way out. Well, I knew that they were having a business meeting. Okay. So I told my sister, we'll go by the table and I'll let you say hello to him because she's salivating. And So we did, and they asked us to join them very graciously. And my sister started to sit down, and I said, "Oh no, we'll be leaving, all this." And he said, "Remind me again." He said, "You tell me your name is Linda Federley, but to me, you're the little girl in the yellow sundress. And that doesn't tell you anything about me. If you think about it, it's 10 years, it tells a hell of a lot about Chris."
Yes, yes, it does. Because how I would have remembered you was this person whose paper kicked my paper's ass. Yeah.
Yeah.
Diana?
My comment was about where the crawdads sing and whether all that scientific description of the bog was an information dump. And I think it was appropriate because the character, she became an acclaimed naturalist from her personal observations of the bog. And so I think that justifies her talking about, the bog in great detail.
Yeah.
Well, and that might have fixed the Thomas Hardy book if that had turned out. But unfortunately, in the Thomas Hardy book, we never, other than seeing the moors in detail, I mean, the moors were the setting for the book. But as I say, I never read, I don't know about anybody else, but it depends what I'm writing, what I can read, because I don't want any voice creep. So when I'm writing crime, I'm reading historical fiction. When I'm writing historical fiction, other than critique partnering, which I do because you have a different hat on then, you're an editor, I'm reading anything but historical fiction. So I get behind on certain TBR piles, just depending on where I am with my own work. And
Thank you for voice creep.
yeah. Voice creep. Well, I have a very bad habit. It works out for me when I'm overseas, but I actually can be a little embarrassing. I actually pick up accents really easily. And when I was a young girl, I went to a competition it had to do with sewing. I was gone for 5 days, and my roommate was from Louisiana. And on the last day, I was sitting at a table, and one of the chaperones was there, and I was talking about skiing, and the chaperone said, "I'm sorry, I have to stop you. I'm so confused. You're obviously from Louisiana. Where do you ski?" And I wasn't from Louisiana, but from being with that person for just 5 days, I was picking up vocal patterns and things. And I think because of that, I've always been very aware. If somebody's got a good narrative voice, I could probably mimic it, but writing is not a situation in which imitation is the greatest form of flattery. Imitation is kind of just plagiarism adjacent, so I don't want to do that.
Any other questions for Sophie, comments? I know there's quite a bit in the chat if anybody wants to repeat what they've written.
I have a kind of slightly off topic question. Since you've written French historical fiction, did you ever, even at the time when you were writing it, find it hard to make an entree with it? Because I'm writing French historical fiction, and I'm in a group of authors, a little authors collaborative that write that. And we kind of feel like, especially in the HNS world, that, oh, France?
Yeah, well, I think we saw a real change, and then now we're seeing something else, because I remember when we didn't, when everything was Tudor or ancient world, and then we started to see stuff opening up, like Chris Gortner wrote a wonderful book set in Spain, and then Michelle Kouchouaba-Moran ended up writing something even after France. She wrote something set in India, and I thought, here we go, like all the eras and all the places are opening up, and then bam, and I have nothing against the interwarriors, but bam, everything became the interwarriors. And I guess the thing I always tell myself is, and this comes from my personal background, I was a large Washington, D.C. law firm litigator and antitrust lawyer. That is a soul-sucking job. And when I gave it up and decided to do this, I told myself I was going to do this because I was never going to make that money doing this, that I was going to do this for the joy. So I have always written what I want to write. That doesn't mean I sell everything. Nobody sells everything. Everybody has like some manuscript that they've written that usually it's the one they think was the best one they've ever written. And I actually majored in history, and my senior thesis was on women war workers in the Second World War. I was a contemporary American social historian. So I could absolutely write something set in the Second World War, the warriors. I just don't want to. And I think that's legitimate. I don't think there's anything wrong with people who want to pick what's in the market right now and write the market. But, that isn't me. Which is probably why there will never be movies of my books, but it's fine. So I would say continue to write it, because you don't know what's going to be next. I think what's interesting now is we're seeing, even within the inner warriors, what's changing is don't bring them the same battle stories. Now we're seeing interesting voices. Like, what's that book that came out fairly recently that is, it's Victorian, but it's a woman studying to be a physician in India. I mean, it's that we're going to see, or Kate Quinn's brilliant novel about the female sniper in World War II. We're going to see the same events, but we're going to see them through different eyes and different eyeballs, which is why when we did the French Revolution book, we did not have a point of view. That's why I wrote Princess Elizabeth and not Marie Antoinette, because we don't need another view of the French Revolution from the viewpoint of Marie Antoinette.
I
So
have
I
one
think-
quick question, Sophie. Do you outline or do you, hang on a sec.
I have historical notes. I know what history is going to go into my books, whether it's my history or my mystery. You can kind of see behind me, and by Fire is right on that shelf. But I am not a person, in fact, I'll tell you how bad it is. When it comes to mystery, I'm working on a new book, and I came down to the kitchen the other day and I said to my husband, oh my God, we need a break in this case. We have 3 bodies in 2 weeks. We need a break. And he's like, you're writing the book. And I said, yeah, but I don't know how it gets solved yet. So I actually don't, I have a basic plot arc and I have the history I want to include, but I'm not a huge plot person. Maybe I'm just too lazy. It could be that. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming, because this was great. And this is such a solitary business. I mean, it really is. Even if you have a big chapter, even if you have friends who write, we spend a lot of time. I mean, in England, I got to see some of my English writing friends, and we all went out and had lunch and everything, but it's mostly very, very solitary. So anytime I can get together, like, I'll be adrenaline rushing all evening. I already said to my husband, we're having takeout. I'm not cooking because my adrenaline is going to be too high. So I want to thank you for inviting me.
I have one more question.
Sure.
What was your personal path to publication? Did you have trouble finding an agent? Who was your first publisher?
Okay, well, I was published first in 2000, either 2011. I think it's 2011. It was 2011, and I got very lucky. I did get an agent, which is very hard, and I had an agent who was a legacy person. He was a person who had been in publishing a long time, and he's actually related to Belgian aristocracy, and his father was an aviator who hated Charles Lindbergh, and we're still friends. He's not my agent anymore, but we're still friends. And he was not interested in whether it was going to be the most marketable thing in the world. So my first book didn't sell, because that's the thing they really don't tell you. They say 2% of people get agents, but they don't tell you only 50 to 60% of those first books sell. So my book didn't sell. So he said, all right, write me another one. And then that put the fear of God into me, right? So he said, well, what ideas do you have? And I told him ideas, and we picked one. He said, so write me another one. And I wrote that book I already had some of the research done, from him telling me, write me another one, to us signing the contract took 9 months, because I was driven by the fire of pure panic that I was going to lose my brilliant agent. And that book was with Berkeley. And then my second book was I migrated to Thomas Dunn St. Martin, my second solo book. Our first collaborative novel, which came out in 2014, which was the Destruction of Pompeii, through 6 authors writing various point of views, that we indie published, and it won an award at HNS, and we were hybrid then. That book just sold to William Morrow. That 2014 book is going to be recycled, new cover, audiobook, the whole deal. And then Ribbons of Scarlet was with William Morrow. And then my most recent, my one that is half historical and half modern, was with Crooked Lane, because they do so much mystery and history. So I've kind of been, I always tell people, I've been with, I think, like three of the big 5 at this point. But it's really anybody's, I don't think anybody's road is straight unless they are a huge New York Times bestseller. And then they're going to keep publishing with who they're publishing with, and they're going to keep getting a lot of support. And I just get up every day and feel like I'm lucky I managed to achieve this, and everything now is gravy. I might never get published again, but I'm going to keep doing this till I stop loving it.
And sometimes the second book is the first one published, and then you get attention on the first.
Well, I never sold my first one. I never sold my first one. And that's okay. Looking back now, I can see why. Probably it was too long, and there's a lot of things. It was very Alexandre Dumas. It had so many plots and so many subplots. And I love that. I have an 18, I think 60s or 70s leather bound version of everything Dumas ever wrote in a set. And it's like one of my prized possessions. But I don't think that's what people read now, that many levels of circuitous plots. And that first book was very, very like that. I mean, if this was the 1800s, I'm sure it would have sold them.
Would you consider putting your email address in the chat?
Oh yeah, or you know what, there's one for each of me, and I will do that. And you can also contact me through my websites.
Yes, I've put both web addresses are in the chat at the very top.
Yeah, but I would say don't spread these around, but this is my Sophie one. It's pretty obvious what it is. And this is my Evie one. I can't spell my own name because it's not my name. That's part of it. That's the beauty of having so many names now is if I ever want to commit a criminal act, I'm totally covered. So, well, thank you again. And like I said, feel free to send me questions or anything else.
I want to say thank you so much, Sophie. It was such a pleasure, such a treat. Thank you so much.
And kind of makes me wish I lived in California, because now I know I could hang with all you guys. We've got a great Chessie chapter here though, so don't tell them I said that. So
Well, come on back to the happy hour again too.
yes, you know what? The problem was England. I was gone for a month, and the idea of I'm not that late night, so it was a 5-hour time difference, and you just don't want to see me that late in the evening. Trust me. So thanks again, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Take care.
That was fantastic. Thanks, Natalie.
Yes, that